Fruits would often be dried to preserve them for longer, and the pharaohs would usually have access to them throughout the whole year. But where's the beef? The Egyptians were fairly advanced in domesticating animals, and they raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They also hunted birds and fished in the rivers, giving them ample supplies of meat. Only the poorest didn't have access to any animal protein, usually subsisting on legumes instead. But hunting and raising animals was a time-consuming process, and subsistence farmers often didn't have the time for it. While the meat on the table would be modest for them, it would be anything but for the pharaohs. There's evidence of the ancient Egyptians raising massive numbers of oxen, with the workers building the Great Pyramid being served beef every day. And for the pharaohs, life was likely a never-ending buffet. The pharaohs had the resources to raise large numbers of domesticated animals, and if they wanted a specific meal, they could always send their servants out to hunt for it. That meant the table was usually filled with wild birds, beef, mutton, pork, fish, and anything else they could get their hands on. This was also the era when one of the most famous delicacies in the world was invented: foie gras. This deliberately fattened goose liver was developed back in the 25th century BCE. They were also fond of eating a much smaller bird, sparrow, which reportedly had aphrodisiac properties. And the pharaoh would build up a big appetite because he was actually pretty busy all day. The day would start with him being dressed and cleaned by his servants, including anointing him with scented oils. Once he was wearing all his robes and jewels, he would go to the audience chamber. There he would face his daily meetings. But don't worry, they would be flattering. After all, he's a king who's also considered a god, and those in the meetings are a combination of commoners, noblemen, and visiting dignitaries. The odds are every single one of them would bow before him as they entered, often presenting him with offerings. The only ones who would not seem to show this level of intense devotion are his everyday advisors. But even they would probably bow to the pharaoh. But even the pharaoh answers to someone. After the daily audiences, the pharaoh would likely go to the temple to pay his tribute to the gods, making the daily offerings with the assistance of the high priest. This is a time of quiet devotion. But it's not just religion that guides him to do this. He's also seen as the shepherd of the country, and if it was to descend into chaos under him, he could be ousted in a coup, potentially even by his own military leaders or advisors. So dutifully, he talks to the statues of the gods and then sacrifices cattle to them with the help of the royal butcher. It's a private affair for the pharaoh, only accompanied by a few trusted people, and it's a rare moment of quiet reflection for the man who rules all of Egypt. But then it's time for the pharaoh to leave the palace. You can't carry out all the royal duties from the safety of the palace, and what would be the fun in that? So it's time to head out on the daily errands, but the pharaoh isn't going to be walking on his own 2 feet. That would be undignified. It would also be risky. So he's likely going to pick between 2 main forms of transportation. The first is the traditional horse-drawn chariot, very useful for when you need to go fast. In fact, many pharaohs like to use the chariots for recreation as well, using them to hunt or race other chariots. Or he could go under foot power, but not his own. The royal litter is a device used for thousands of years, and it's as simple as can be: a small chamber containing a comfortable seat for His Royal Majesty, attached to several poles that will be carried by entrusted servants. A small litter might be transported by only 2 people holding on 2 poles, but larger ones, like those fit for a king, would likely be transported by 4 people at a time. This would be the ideal mode of transportation for a king out on local errands. So, what would a king actually get up to on his daily errands? The pharaoh usually had a lot of different construction projects going on at a time, with each site being run by a royal foreman. He would regularly visit each site, getting a look at the progress and presenting any updates to the plans. He would also take general tours of the city to let people see him. This is a useful way to build up the loyalty of the local population and keep them from becoming disconnected from the royal family. This is the biggest event of the day, with many locals crowding around to catch a glimpse of the man they view as an avatar of the gods. And from there, it's back to the palace for dinner and a relaxing night's sleep. The pharaohs seem to live a charmed life, but one area poses concerns. The pharaohs were powerful in almost every way, but they were also mortal. Many of them had surprisingly short reigns, including the famous King Tut, who was on the throne by age 9 and deceased by age 18, likely from a combination of health conditions he was born with and injuries suffered in what might have been a chariot accident. While the pharaohs had access to better health care than the average Egyptian citizen, they also lacked access to modern medicine because it hadn't been invented yet. And that meant they were vulnerable to a whole host of conditions. The Egyptians did have some surprisingly modern medical techniques, including minor surgeries to repair broken bones and sew up injuries. And they had access to a number of medicines, but one area they were lacking was modern antibiotics. The Egyptian doctors did seem to understand basic principles, while there was no understanding of concepts like bacteria back then. Some ancient texts used fermented beer as a treatment for infections. It may have been better than nothing, but it wasn't as effective as modern treatments, tombs, which meant there was always a risk that one minor cut could turn into a serious infection and end anyone's life, even a king's. And there was another major risk factor to being a pharaoh, and it started way before they were even born. Who was worthy enough to marry a pharaoh? Well, clearly not a commoner, and most lower-tier nobles probably didn't qualify either. Clearly we gotta keep it in the family, so Egyptian royal families were heavily inbred. It was common for kings to marry a sister, often a half-sister from one of the previous pharaoh's other wives. This reduced the genetic inbreeding, but it was still common for pharaohs to be born with genetic conditions. King Tut was born with a club foot, scoliosis, and potentially a genetic condition like Marfan syndrome that might have contributed to his early demise. But with Pharaoh's death isn't really the end. Death was right around the corner for everyone in ancient Egypt, and they were firm believers in an afterlife, so it was common for pharaohs to begin planning for their death long before they were expecting it. One of the most important tasks of a pharaoh's life was designing their own tombstone, ranging from an impressive memorial palace to a magnificent giant pyramid that would hopefully still be standing thousands of years later. These tombs are among the most significant architectural achievements left from ancient Egypt. It might seem morbid to plan so thoroughly for your own death, especially as a young kid, but because the Egyptians had such a literal view of the afterlife, it was almost comforting. Death, no matter how or when it happened, was just the next step of the journey, and they wanted to be well equipped. In addition to building their final resting place, they would often carefully pick what they'd be taking to the grave with them. This often meant their most treasured possessions, plus a healthy supply of food just in case. Despite how often the media brings it up, sacrificing one's servants to take with you in the afterlife was exceedingly rare, although animal sacrifices were very common. And when the pharaoh passed on, his history would repeat itself. Sort of. The pharaoh's day typically begins with his servants dressing him and preparing him for the day, and that would happen one last time after death in a much more thorough manner. This time they would be preparing for a mummification. This would include removing all the tissues filled with liquid that would be most likely to rot, including the brain and most of the internal organs, which would be preserved in canopic jars. The body would then be embalmed and placed in an ornate coffin, where it would be laid to rest in the massive tomb that had been built, preserved in a mostly airtight chamber, where it would remain surprisingly intact thousands of years later. And soon a new pharaoh would take the throne, with a strict schedule and a huge team of servants to help him carry out the task of ruling the greatest empire in the ancient world.